just to stay relevant. And I've always considered myself more of an investigative reporter when it comes to religion. I bring the little I know to the table, and I try to give people a different perspective on Judaism. I mean, I promote Judaism. I believe what's good for me is good for others. I proselytize Judaism. I encourage people to become Jewish without belittling other religions, right? I try to amplify my religion instead of attacking other religions. However, I've done many debates with Muslims, atheists, Christians. And all right, we got the room filling up here. We got Julia.
Shalom. I do have a question. I know in the past you have said that, in your opinion, you don't believe that that God can see into the future. So I guess my question is, like, what do you make of it when, I guess, when he's speaking to Abraham and basically is telling him, like, this is what I'm going to give you, or this is what I want for you, and, you know, boom, he has a child, and then boom, he has, you know, the land of Israel. Like, do you see that as more of a premonition, or more of like his words, I guess, like blessings, or what do you make of that?
Mm-hmm. Now, only because God doesn't know the future doesn't mean that he doesn't cause things to happen. The child that he gave Sarah, which is really akin to a virgin birth, I guess you would never mention that. Right? This is a woman who couldn't have children anymore, at least not at that age, and poof, she had a child. It seems that he made that happen. One, she wanted it to happen, and he made it happen. That doesn't necessarily mean that he knows the future. Don't forget, the borders that he promised Abraham were never really met. It seems that was the promise, but it was conditional for us to actually conquer all the land that was promised to Abraham. But it was from the two great rivers that includes parts of even Persia. I don't know why people are happy with the borders we have now for Israel. I mean, the state of Israel now is nothing biblical. But even in the time of King David expanded the borders to parts of Syria. But it shows that even in that instance, it seems, unless the Bible is recording it inaccurately, the Jews never really claimed the land that was promised to Abraham. But I don't claim that the Bible justifies my position completely. There's just some parts I don't understand, but it just seems that it contradicts free will to assume that God knows what you're going to do before you even do it, and he expects you to still come and repent. It seems like too much of an experiment. That's why. It's just a personal preference of mine. Also, I believe that God cannot know the illogical. God can't know what you're going to do if you haven't even done it yet or thought it yet. God can make a square circle. I think because we watch a lot of science fiction, we believe that God must know the future, but there is no future because it hasn't been acted out yet. I'm not the only person who held this belief. There's the most famous rabbi I could think of is a rabbi named Gershonides, who was known for holding this position. The Rambam, also in Pirkei Avot, says that everything's under heaven but the fear of heaven. He says that the only thing that God knows regarding what's going to take place is regarding kohot hateva, the forces of nature. He knows if it's going to rain, if it's not going to rain. In terms of you making the right decision or the wrong decision, he doesn't know. One could say that he chooses not to know, but I think logically, ethically, it makes more sense that he doesn't know at all. Because then how can he reward you properly if he knew who was going to come to the correct knowledge of Torah and who wasn't from the beginning? At least in Torah itself, I don't see it so prevalent. In the books of the prophets, it's a little more prevalent of him knowing the future, but I don't see it as a principle laid down in Torah. That's just my personal opinion. I'm not saying it's laid down as a principle that he doesn't know what's going to happen and what's not going to happen, but there are a lot of things that don't appear in Torah black and white that we sort of interject, even like the notion of monotheism or the notion that God can't become a man, that he has no corporeal qualities. These are all things that I embrace and Judaism made popular and the Muslims really ran with, but aren't literal in the Torah as tenets of our religion. So only because something doesn't literally appear in the Torah doesn't mean that you can't hold it as a tenet to your own personal belief system. But I'm not going to say that if someone believes that God does know the future, that he's wrong. I'm just giving my personal opinion. Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
I think that God has to make himself lovable and approachable, being that we are the center of creation, right? All this, it was created for us. This notion that God created you with all these flaws and the urge to sin, and at the same time is able to punish you or give you a reward knowing what you're going to do even before you're going to do it, seems like an unjust God. It seems like we're just mice in a maze. That's the problem I have with assuming that he knows the future. But it's really not a limiting of God if you don't believe that there's anything to be known. If the future doesn't exist, then God could still know everything that there is to be known and still not know the future because it doesn't exist yet. So it depends how you want to view it, because some people will say, oh, well, you're limiting God. Well, I mean, come on. I think, was it St. Thomas Aquinas who made the argument, or was it St. Francis of Assisi, that can God create a stone too big enough that he can't lift? These arguments are above my pay grade. I try to focus on the ethics that the Bible, the Torah, brings to the table, and not these hypothetical quandaries.
I have a question for you.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, what are the arguments exactly against the Samaritan Chumash? I got this from that discussion you had with Film Reporter.
Right.
And I was just curious, like, what are the arguments against their Chumash besides the differences in, like, Mount Gerizim and things of that nature?
That's the only real difference outside of variations in spelling, which, I mean, people, I've heard Tovia Singer say that every Torah scroll is identical. That's nonsense. Sephardim have a different tradition. Ashkenazim have a different tradition. The narrative doesn't change. The mitzvot don't change, but there's an extra letter here, one less letter there. Also, in the Scrolls of Esther, every Megillah, each community had their own little spelling variations. I mentioned to my friend, he purchased a Megillah from a Temani Sofer, and it was different from this other Ashkenazi Megillah we had. So that's really the only place the Samaritan Torah differs, with the exception of that instance of Mount Gerizim, that God said that we should worship in Mount Gerizim and basically stay there. And they have 6 books because they include the book of Joshua, which is very important because it's really like the completion of the first 5 books. The 5 books never mentioned Israel entering Israel. It seems like Joshua is as important as there even being a book of Genesis. Don't forget, the Torah never says that there's 5 books of the Torah. It's only a tradition that there's 5 books of the Torah. Technically, one could say there's really only 4 books in the Torah. There's 2 commandments in the book of Genesis that the rabbis don't apply towards Israel because it's reiterated later on regarding procreation and circumcision. Well, not just that. I guess being allowed to eat meat. All these things are reiterated later on. I wouldn't say that it's so horrendous to include the book of Joshua into your Torah scroll if you have no issue including the book of Genesis. The thing is, Torah means instructions. So from Exodus 22, like all the way to the end of Deuteronomy, it's God transmitting his will through Moses all through the wilderness. Torah is not necessarily the 5 books. The Torah are the commandments within the Torah. Being that prophets can't institute anything new or bring any new commands, not that Joshua was a prophet. This is why I rather not include the book of Joshua. I mean, I rather really not include the book of Genesis, but it's there. So colloquially, we call Torah the 5 books, but it's just the commandments within the Torah. This is also not just my opinion. Rav Tzadok Gaon, he wrote a parish to Sefer Yehoshua, and then he says there, when the Israelites are entering the land of Israel, God tells the Israelites to write the law on stones in the river. They ask the question, how can you write the whole Torah on stones? I believe it's 12 stones, like, if I'm not mistaken. So then he says that when it says law in the Chumash and in Tanakh, it means the commandments within the Torah, not the narrative, not to assume. Because I've heard many people teach us that on Mount Sinai, the whole Torah was given. And when the Jews were walking through the wilderness, they had the narrative of things that didn't happen yet. It's very stupid to assume this. First of all, the whole Torah wasn't given on Mount Sinai. The transmission began on Sinai and ended at the end of Deuteronomy, even though Deuteronomy is considered the repetition of the law. We have laws that appear in Deuteronomy that don't appear elsewhere, and they're very important laws, like the law to accept a prophet. There's nowhere in the Torah that it tells you that you must listen to prophets, but Deuteronomy chapter 18. The law to establish the court, to heed the instructions of the court. Not just the creation of the court. There's a death penalty that appears in Deuteronomy chapter 17 for not heeding the instructions of the judges. The instance that it tells us that we're allowed to have a king. The whole notion of Mashiach doesn't appear in any other book in the Torah but Deuteronomy. I've had discussions with people who believe in the documentary hypothesis, I believe. And so the ones who aren't as academically inclined, the ones who are more religious, will then say that the book of Deuteronomy was the only one that was fabricated and not given over by God. But the most important commands that affect us socially, like there being a governing body in a census, only appears in Deuteronomy. One of the most crucial commands that deal with exile and redemption, i.e. listening to a prophet when we begin to emulate the nations of the world, appears in Deuteronomy. Yeah. Welcome, J-Dub.
Hey, what's going on, Rabbi? Sorry I'm late. I apologize.
No problem. No problem.
Got the show going. We got a full crowd. Looks good.
Looks good.
Have you been reading the comments from the outside, or should I bring you in?
Yeah, no, bring them in. I just want to make sure that the person who asked that question, Mr. Jones. Yeah, Mr. Jones. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, you definitely answered my question.
Okay.